December 7th, 1942. Watertown Arsenal, Massachusetts. The chill of winter cut through the steel hangars as Lieutenant Colonel Charles S. Billings adjusted his thick wool overcoat and peered at the gleaming barrels lined across the assembly floor. Each 155-millimeter long tom cannon stretched over 30 feet in length, its massive recoil mechanism polished to a mirror sheen, its carriage nearly the weight of a small tank. Billings exhaled through frost-laden air, tracing the dimensions in his mind. The specifications alone were staggering. A maximum range of 14 miles, a shell weight of 133 pounds, a muzzle velocity exceeding 2,800 feet per second. These were not ordinary field guns. They were instruments of destruction, capable of obliterating fortified bunkers and turning entire enemy positions into rubble before infantry even advanced. Engineers moved with methodical precision, checking breech assemblies, hydraulic rams, and the intricate recoil systems. Remember, Billings reminded the assembly crew, accuracy isn't just distance, it's timing, calculation, and repetition. One misplaced shell wastes manpower, time, and gives the enemy a chance to survive. Around him, young machinists, many barely 20, tightened bolts that would eventually survive the concussive force of 133-pound shells. Wartime exigency had thrown them into a world of rapid innovation, where mistakes meant delays in a war that demanded overwhelming firepower. Elsewhere, in a drafty planning room at the Pentagon, Major General George S. Patton leaned over a map of North Africa, tracing the contours of Tunisian ridge lines and German-held coastal fortifications. His finger paused at the Maref line. "They think they can hold here," Patton said, voice low, half to himself, half to his staff. "Let's see how they handle the long toms." He had been briefed weeks earlier on the 155mm capabilities. Unlike shorter-range artillery, the long tom could reach German fortifications from positions far beyond counter-battery fire, making entire defensive networks obsolete. Patton's eyes glinted with the same mix of admiration and anticipation that Billings felt at Watertown. This weapon, when deployed, would not just fire shells, it would rewrite tactical calculations. Back in Massachusetts, the first long tom prototypes underwent rigorous testing. The massive recoil sent engineers flying across concrete floors during early firings. Splintered wooden pads replaced hastily as lessons were learned. Each gun required 16 men to assemble, emplace, and aim. Unlike lighter artillery, mobility was a challenge. Trains, heavy trucks, and later pontoons would be required to move these giants from factory to front lines. Yet every ounce of effort was justified when the first shell arced over Watertown, punching a target 12,000 yards away with deadly precision. The echo of the blast rattled the steel beams of the hangar, a sonic reminder of the power contained within the polished barrels. Secrecy was paramount. Even among Allied forces, knowledge of the long tom's deployment was restricted. Photographs were classified, detailed schematics distributed only to units designated for transport and operation. German intelligence would soon notice unusual shipping manifests and oversized crates arriving in North Africa. But initial reports dismissed them as ordinary artillery, too slow, too cumbersome to make a battlefield difference. What they could not know, what no one outside a few high-level planners understood, was that the combination of range, accuracy, and firepower would systematically reduce the effectiveness of static defenses and fortress lines. By late December, the first production long toms were being prepared for shipment to the Mediterranean. Billings inspected the crates, each marked with strict instructions for handling. The guns would travel by rail to New York, then across the Atlantic on Liberty ships. Each cannon weighed nearly 30,000 pounds, disassembled into manageable components, yet the sheer scale of the operation hinted at the coming transformation. These guns were not just tools, they were a statement that industrial ingenuity and careful planning could create weapons capable of crushing fortifications, rewriting the rules of ground combat, and forcing German commanders to reconsider everything they thought they knew about defense. In the cold morning sunlight, the barrels gleamed one last time before shipment. Billings exhaled, a mixture of pride and apprehension. The hidden giants were leaving the arsenal. Soon they would arrive in a distant desert, set against ridges and bunkers, and the war would never be the same. January 3rd, 1943, New York Harbor. The first of the Long Tom shipments rested in the cavernous holds of Liberty ships, their massive crates chained and braced against the rolling deck. Sailors and stevedores moved with precise choreography, aware that each crate contained the promise of overwhelming firepower. The Atlantic was unforgiving in winter, waves slapping the hull like iron fists, and the cold seeped through every layer of clothing. Lieutenant Colonel Billings, now overseeing the loading operation, wrapped his scarf tighter and scanned the horizon. German U-boats prowled these waters, a constant threat to shipments critical to the Allied war effort. The secrecy surrounding the Long Toms had to be maintained. Intelligence leaks could alert the Germans to the arrival of weapons capable of leveling fortifications from miles away. Each Liberty ship carried only a handful of cannons, disassembled into transportable sections: barrel, carriage, recoil assembly, and sighting apparatus. The weight of the components was staggering. A single barrel weighed nearly 14,000 pounds, yet it had to be loaded with care, ensuring that every bearing, pin, and bolt arrived undamaged. Improvised wooden cradles absorbed shocks from the ship's motion, and engineers monitored stress points throughout the voyage. Even a minor dent could compromise accuracy, a risk that could cost lives when the guns were eventually fired at fortified German positions. Across the Atlantic, U-boat commanders noted unusual traffic, but dismissed it as routine ordnance shipments. Allied naval intelligence had deployed extensive countermeasures: convoy systems, zigzag routes, and air cover when possible. The convoy carrying the first Long Toms, escorted by destroyers equipped with sonar and depth charges, pressed steadily forward. In the night, the distant thrum of enemy engines could occasionally be detected, but the combination of deception and firepower kept German submarines at bay. On deck, sailors adjusted ropes and braces, shouting over the wind. They could not see the ultimate impact of what they carried, yet instinctively recognized its importance. By mid-January, the convoy reached Casablanca, French Morocco. Dock workers, briefed only on the oversized cargo, offloaded the components with cranes and heavy trucks. Each section was carefully inventoried. Major James "Jimmy" Hargrove, one of the first artillery officers assigned to the North African theater, inspected the crates. "These are monsters," he muttered, tracing the outline of a barrel with gloved hands. "But if we get them emplaced properly, nothing in the desert will stand against them." His words were not exaggeration. The Long Tom's range allowed it to reach enemy positions well behind front lines, hitting supply depots, bunkers, and rail networks without ever exposing crews to direct fire. Transport to forward positions proved a challenge. Desert terrain was unforgiving. Sand clogged gears, trucks struggled with the immense weight, and engineers improvised reinforced sleds and steel mats to move the guns over dunes. Crews learned to disassemble and reassemble cannons in the field, a task requiring both strength and meticulous attention to tolerances. Each gun emplacement took hours of labor, including leveling, stabilizing recoil platforms, and calibrating targeting instruments. Observers watched as the first shells were fired during field trials, their impact creating massive craters and obliterating mock fortifications. The sound carried for miles, a deep, threatening rumble that left even veteran soldiers in awe. Meanwhile, German intelligence slowly began to notice reports of unusually destructive artillery in the Tunisian theater. Field agents described explosions that leveled reinforced bunkers and disrupted troop movements miles behind the front line. Initial reports underestimated the threat, assuming conventional field guns with heavier than normal shells. They had no idea that the Allies were employing 155mm long toms, guns that combined range, accuracy, and destructive power on a scale never before seen in North Africa. By the end of January 1943, the first long toms were fully operational near the Mareth Line. Allied officers observed the initial bombardments, calculating trajectories and adjusting firing tables with obsessive precision. Each shell landed exactly where intended, shattering fortifications and spreading panic among German defenders. Soldiers whispered in awe, calling the cannons hidden giants for their ability to strike with impunity from unseen positions. The stage was set for a transformation of the battlefield, a weapon that would force entrenched German positions to crumble under relentless, precise, and overwhelming firepower. February 20th, 1943. Pre-dawn hours, southern Tunisia. The desert was quiet, save for the occasional shifting of sand and distant vehicle engines. Allied artillery crews, huddled against the cold, checked their instruments with meticulous care. Each 155mm long tom was emplaced on reinforced steel mats, leveled and braced, its massive barrel pointing toward the German defenses along the Mareth Line. Major Hargrove walked along the line, inspecting recoil systems, alignment gauges, and fuses. The men had trained endlessly for this moment, but nothing could fully prepare them for the sensation of firing a gun of such scale for the first time in combat. The target had been carefully selected, a fortified bunker complex believed to house artillery, supply depots, and command posts. Reconnaissance photographs showed thick concrete walls and interlaced trenches nearly impervious to conventional field artillery. Allied planners had calculated coordinates to the inch, and fire control officers double-checked tables and adjusted for wind, air density, and elevation. The first shell, a 133-pound armor-piercing round, was loaded with coordinated effort. 4 men struggled with the carriage, while the gunner secured the firing mechanism. At 600 hours, Major Hargrove gave the order. The trigger was pulled. The long tom recoiled violently, the barrel rising nearly a foot before settling back. The first shell soared across the desert in a low arc, disappearing from view within seconds. Moments later, the impact detonated with a shockwave that rattled nearby tents, cracked sandbags, and sent a plume of debris hundreds of feet into the air. German soldiers, sleeping or preparing defenses, were startled awake by the reverberation. They had been accustomed to shell fire, but nothing of this magnitude had ever landed on their positions. The second round followed almost immediately, adjusted for minor deviations from the first. It struck a supply bunker directly, collapsing the roof and igniting fuel barrels stored inside. Flames licked the sky as explosions ricocheted through nearby structures. Allied spotters using binoculars and forward observers relayed corrections for each subsequent shell. The long toms fired with terrifying efficiency, each shell arriving with uncanny precision. Within 15 minutes, the fortified positions were in ruins, communications destroyed, and German morale shaken. German field reports from the Mareth Line describe a bewildering enemy. Observers noted artillery fire coming from impossible distances, hitting with surgical accuracy.
Units attempted to counter-battery the Americans, but the range of the long toms exceeded that of standard German field pieces. Soldiers wrote of a thundering giant, a weapon that seemed untouchable.
Its shots arriving without warning, shattering bunkers and trenches alike. Panic began to spread among forward units as leadership struggled to maintain cohesion under bombardment from unseen guns. By mid-morning, the Long Tom crews had completed coordinated barrages across multiple targets. Ammunition stocks were rotated, fuses recalibrated, and firing patterns adjusted to maintain relentless pressure. Casualty estimates indicated dozens of German soldiers killed instantly, while many more were wounded or trapped under collapsed structures. The psychological impact proved as decisive as the physical destruction. Officers reported frenzied attempts to retreat, soldiers abandoning positions without orders, and entire units rendered ineffective by fear of the next strike. Allied command took meticulous notes. The Mareth Line, once thought impenetrable, had begun to crumble under artillery fire. Field commanders observed that the Long Tom did more than destroy fortifications. It disrupted command and control, impaired logistics, and forced the enemy to reconsider their defensive posture. Each shell was not only a projectile, but a tool of tactical transformation, enabling subsequent infantry and armor advances with minimal resistance. By nightfall, the first Long Tom deployment had achieved its objectives. German defenses were weakened, bunkers reduced to rubble, and forward units disoriented. The desert echoed with the distant rumbles of artillery, a new sound of American industrial power made manifest in the field. Major Hargrove surveyed the aftermath with quiet satisfaction. "We've changed the battlefield today," he told his men, "and this is only the beginning." March 5, 1943. Tunisia. Nightfall. The desert was quiet, but far to the west, the Axis supply routes stretched like lifelines across arid plains and narrow coastal roads. Trucks, convoys, and rail cars carried fuel, ammunition, and rations to embattled German and Italian units at the front. Allied intelligence had tracked these routes for weeks, using reconnaissance photographs, intercepted radio traffic, and local informants. The target? The infrastructure that sustained the Mareth Line. Without it, the fortifications crumbled, no matter how strong their concrete walls. General Patton, overseeing operations in the region, understood the strategic significance. Conventional artillery could harass the enemy, but it was the 155mm long toms that could strike the arteries of the Axis army. Hidden in desert wadis and behind camouflage netting, the massive guns waited. Crews worked under blackout conditions, coordinating positions, calculating firing tables, and confirming coordinates with precision that would rival any surveying expedition. Every decimal in windage and elevation mattered. A single miscalculation could send a shell miles off target, revealing the gun's position to enemy observers. By 0200 hours, the first salvo began. Long Tom shells arced silently against the starlit sky, landing with devastating impact on supply depots, fuel storage tanks, and bridge supports along the Wadi Zigzag and coastal highway. Flames erupted as fuel ignited, sending plumes visible for miles. Trucks attempting to maneuver through narrow passes were obliterated before reaching the front. Telegraph poles splintered, cutting communication lines. Soldiers in forward positions scrambled to respond, only to discover their lines of supply severed by invisible American artillery. The destruction was both systematic and methodical. Each firing battery worked in concert with aerial reconnaissance and forward observers. When a bridge or rail junction was destroyed, follow-up shells targeted repair crews, preventing rapid reconstruction. The Long Tom's range, up to 14 miles, allowed it to strike with impunity from positions outside of counter-battery fire. German artillery units attempted retaliation, but most lacked the range, accuracy, and mobility to respond effectively.
Reports from the Africa Corps noted bewilderment. Supply columns disappeared overnight, and engineers tasked with repair were under constant bombardment. By midday, the impact was unmistakable. Fuel shortages forced armored units to halt. Trucks carrying rations were destroyed before reaching their destinations, and ammunition depots lay in ruins. Officers recorded the first signs of collapse. Tanks immobilized by lack of fuel, artillery silenced for want of shells, and forward positions abandoned to preserve men and materiel. The psychological toll on Axis troops was profound. Soldiers accustomed to moving with disciplined precision now faced uncertainty at every turn, unable to predict whether resupply would arrive or if the next shell would strike with lethal accuracy. Allied command recognized the broader implications. The long toms were not merely artillery, they were instruments of strategic disruption. By severing supply lines, the guns amplified the effectiveness of infantry, armor, and air units. Allied convoys moved with far less interference, while German counterattacks faltered due to logistical paralysis. Intelligence reports highlighted the unprecedented coordination of firepower, noting that entire supply nodes could be neutralized in a single night, changing the tempo of the campaign in favor of the Allies. By nightfall, the results were undeniable. The Mareth Line's defenders faced dwindling ammunition, parched men, and immobilized vehicles. Forward positions previously held with confidence became untenable. The long toms had done more than destroy material. They had shattered the backbone of the enemy's operational capability. Major Hargrove, surveying the lit horizon from a concealed observation post, noted in his log, "The desert carries our message tonight. Without supply, there is no defense. Tomorrow the infantry will find their path cleared." March 23, 1943, El Guettar, Tunisia. The sun rose over the jagged hills surrounding the town, casting long shadows across rocky ridges and the olive-studded valleys where German and Italian forces had entrenched themselves. For weeks, Patton's II Corps had been probing the Mareth Line, testing enemy defenses and preparing for the decisive assault. But the breakthrough would not come from infantry alone. It would be orchestrated with the firepower of the 155mm long toms, the artillery that had already shattered Axis supply lines and morale across Tunisia. In the hours before the attack, American observers adjusted their coordinates with painstaking care. Reconnaissance photographs of German positions, combined with intercepted signals and prisoner interrogations, allowed engineers to calculate the range, elevation, and azimuth of every gun.
The long toms, positioned on hills beyond the effective reach of Axis counter-battery fire, would strike simultaneously on enemy fortifications, artillery emplacements, and command posts. Each shell, weighing over 95 pounds, carried explosive power capable of leveling reinforced bunkers and cutting through steel-reinforced concrete. At 0500 hours, the first salvo rang out. The shells arched over the ridges in perfect trajectories, detonating with concussive force that shook the ground for miles. The explosions tore through the German defensive lines, sending debris and smoke into the cold morning air. Machine gun nests crumbled, trenches filled with shattered earth, and artillery positions were rendered inoperative before the crews could react. German soldiers, who had spent weeks confident in their prepared positions, were forced into frantic repositioning under the relentless barrage. Major General Lloyd Friedendahl, coordinating from a forward command post, noted the effect immediately. The long toms had achieved what infantry alone could not: disorientation and disruption. The enemy's defensive fire was disorganized, with tanks immobilized by shattered fuel depots and communication lines severed. Reports from forward observers indicated that entire sectors of the German line had been neutralized before the first American foot crossed the wire. It was not just destruction, it was the creation of opportunity. By mid-morning, Patton's armored and infantry units advanced into the gaps created by the bombardment. Sherman tanks and M3 Lees moved cautiously through valleys cleared by artillery fire, while infantry exploited the chaos to seize ridges and crossroads. Axis resistance was sporadic and disjointed. Soldiers who had prepared for a coordinated defense now faced isolated units under relentless pressure, unable to coordinate counterattacks. Artillery that could have slowed the advance had been destroyed or forced to fire ineffectively from cover. The psychological impact was as profound as the physical. German officers reported confusion and panic among their troops, many of whom had never encountered artillery capable of such sustained precision and destructive power. Soldiers abandoned fortified positions, retreating into the hills to avoid annihilation. Captured diaries and post-war interviews described the fear generated by the deafening explosions and the impossibility of predicting where the next shell would strike. "It was as if the desert itself had turned against us," wrote one officer. By mid-afternoon, El Guitar itself fell. American forces had crossed the defensive lines, capturing the town and securing vital terrain for the continued advance into central Tunisia. The Long Toms continued to fire in support, targeting retreating columns and reinforcing positions to prevent counterattacks. Their contribution was decisive. Without the ability to neutralize fortified positions and disrupt supply lines, the American advance would have been far slower and costlier. Patton later reflected in his operational notes. The guns did not just fire. They opened the path. Infantry and armor could move when no one had moved before. The 155mm Long Toms turned impossibility into opportunity, and El Guitar became proof of that power. The breakthrough at El Guitar marked a turning point in the North African campaign. It demonstrated the strategic potential of long-range artillery, not merely as a weapon of destruction, but as a tool for shaping the battlefield, dislocating enemy forces and enabling maneuver warfare. The Marith Line, once thought impenetrable, had been breached not by numbers alone, but by firepower, harnessed with precision, planning, and understanding of terrain. July 10th, 1943. The waters off Sicily glimmered under the early morning sun as the first waves of Operation Husky's landing craft approached the beaches. For months, Allied planners had anticipated fierce resistance from German and Italian defenders, and the success of the invasion depended not only on infantry and armor, but on the firepower that could neutralize entrenched positions before troops even set foot on sand. Among these weapons, the 155mm Long Tom proved indispensable, a silent architect of destruction poised miles inland to shape the battlefield from afar. In the rugged hills overlooking Gela and Licata, American artillerymen had spent weeks emplacing the Long Toms. Camouflaged against reconnaissance aircraft and positioned beyond the range of German counter-battery fire, the guns were ready to engage in pre-landing bombardment. Forward observers, equipped with field telephones and visual spotting posts, coordinated fire plans that targeted coastal defenses, machine gun nests, and fortified artillery positions. Every calculation, the trajectory, range, and elevation of the 95-pound shells was verified multiple times to ensure maximum effectiveness. At 0500 hours, the first salvo rang out. The shells arced over the ridges in perfect trajectories, detonating with concussive force that shook the ground for miles. The explosions tore through the German defensive lines, sending debris and smoke into the cold morning air. Machine gun nests crumbled, trenches filled with shattered earth, and artillery positions were rendered inoperative before the crews could react. German soldiers, who had spent weeks confident in their prepared positions, were forced into frantic repositioning under the relentless barrage. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, coordinating from a forward command post, noted the effect immediately. The Long Toms had achieved what infantry alone could not: disorientation and disruption. The enemy's defensive fire was disorganized, with tanks immobilized by shattered fuel depots and communication lines severed. Reports from forward observers indicated that entire sectors of the German line had been neutralized before the first American foot crossed the wire. It was not just destruction. It was the creation of opportunity. Frustration and awe, noting that we could not maneuver without being under threat from unseen guns. As Allied forces pushed northward through the Sicilian interior, long toms were emplaced along strategic ridgelines and valleys, often moved under the cover of darkness to evade observation. Each shell fired against entrenched positions combined shock, destruction, and psychological pressure. Troops reported that the sound alone, an ear-splitting roar followed by earth-shaking detonation, induced fear, hesitation, and rapid withdrawal. In combat diaries, American soldiers remarked that the guns spoke louder than any rifle and made the enemy's defenses crumble before we even fired a shot. By the time the campaign moved onto the Italian mainland in September 1943, the 155mm long tom had proven itself indispensable in combined operations. From Salerno to Monte Cassino, the artillery provided the means to reduce fortified positions, interdict reinforcements, and support maneuver warfare in rugged terrain. Its long-range capability allowed the Allies to strike deep into enemy lines while remaining relatively safe from counter-battery fire. The result was a steady, methodical advance up the Italian peninsula, with fewer casualties than anticipated, and the ability to maintain operational tempo against determined resistance. The long tom's impact extended beyond raw destruction. It reshaped tactical thinking, allowing commanders to plan operations that integrated firepower, maneuver, and logistics in a coordinated way. Soldiers and officers alike came to view the gun not merely as a weapon, but as a force multiplier, capable of turning prepared defenses into opportunities for decisive action. The psychological imprint on Axis forces, who had once relied on the invulnerability of bunkers and fortified hills, was profound. By the end of 1943, the 155mm long tom was recognized as a key instrument in the Allied arsenal, a weapon whose reach, accuracy, and destructive power redefined the possibilities of modern artillery. June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy were a maelstrom of fire, water, and steel. Amid the chaos of landing craft, smoke, and crashing waves, American artillery units had already begun to demonstrate the secret weapon that would shape the outcome of the invasion, the M12 motor carrier. Hidden in the bocage and positioned miles inland, the guns waited for their orders, poised to strike at fortified German positions that had repulsed countless assaults in the past. In the weeks preceding D-Day, intelligence officers and forward observers had painstakingly mapped every known German battery, pillbox, and command post. Every long tom emplacement was sighted to maximize the element of surprise, leveraging terrain, concealment, and calculated range. From these positions, the 95-pound shells could reach targets up to 14 miles away, delivering concentrated devastation with precision that defied the expectations of seasoned Wehrmacht officers. At 0600 hours, as the first troops scrambled onto Omaha and Utah beaches, the long toms began firing. The initial salvos struck artillery positions on bluffs overlooking the beaches, silencing guns that had threatened the landing forces for months. Machine gun nests erupted in flames, fortifications crumbled, and communication lines were severed. German defenders, accustomed to relying on observation posts and prepared fields of fire, found themselves under attack from invisible guns delivering earth-shattering explosions with terrifying regularity. By mid-morning, the long toms were engaged in interdiction fire, targeting German reinforcements attempting to move toward the front lines. Convoys of trucks, armored vehicles, and supply columns were obliterated before they could reach the beaches. Every shell created a zone of destruction that forced survivors to abandon equipment and retreat under fire.
The psychological effect was immediate. Reports from captured soldiers described an omnipresent, unseen force that seemed capable of striking anywhere, anytime. Soldiers in dugouts and trenches described the sensation as the ground itself shaking beneath us, and we could not see where the next shell would land. As the Allies secured the beachheads and pushed inland, the Long Toms moved forward to support combined arms operations. From positions overlooking Saint-Lô and Caen, American artillerymen executed coordinated fire missions that softened enemy defenses before infantry assaults and armored breakthroughs. Forward observers directed fire with meticulous precision, calling out coordinates that reduced bunkers, roadblocks, and fortified villages to rubble. Engineers and infantry advanced behind a continuous curtain of explosions, their progress measured in meters but secured by tons of high-explosive shells raining down from afar. German reports from Army Group B noted both the efficiency and terror of the Long Tom. Commanders documented that entrenched units had been neutralized without direct infantry engagement. Supply lines were severed, and morale was shattered. Units that had held against repeated assaults in Italy and the Pacific now found themselves vulnerable to destruction from a distance. In letters and diaries, German soldiers described a profound sense of helplessness. One officer wrote, "The ground itself betrays us. We do not know where the next shell will fall, but we know it will come, and it will be fatal." Beyond direct destruction, the Long Toms enabled operational flexibility. Divisional commanders used the guns to cover flanks, interdict retreat routes, and create overlapping fields of fire that compounded the effects of air power and armored units. When the Allies faced counterattacks from elite Waffen-SS formations, the 155mm shells disrupted concentrations of infantry and armor before they could engage, allowing American units to maintain the initiative. By July 1944, the 155mm Long Tom had established itself as a decisive instrument on the Western Front. Its combination of range, accuracy, and destructive power reshaped German defensive planning, forcing the Wehrmacht to disperse forces and cede strategic terrain. The guns were no longer merely artillery, they were instruments of operational dominance, capable of shaping battles before the first rifle shot was fired. September 12, 1944. The dense forests and fortified bunkers of the Siegfried Line loomed across the border of Germany. For months, American and British forces had probed the defensive belt, encountering heavily reinforced positions, minefields, and barbed wire that had turned previous assaults into costly stalemates. Yet, among the Allies' arsenal, one weapon had emerged as the decisive factor in breaching these fortifications: the 155mm Long Tom.
From camouflaged positions miles behind the front, artillery crews readied the guns for another day of relentless pounding. Each emplacement had been surveyed, measured, and coordinated with aerial reconnaissance to ensure maximum impact. Calculating elevation, powder charges, and trajectory with meticulous care, the crews prepared to unleash shells that could penetrate concrete bunkers, obliterate machine gun nests, and create paths for infantry and armor to advance. The roar of the Long Tom's blast signaled both destruction and inevitability. The first salvo struck at dawn. German fortifications, reinforced with steel and concrete, quivered under the sheer force of the 95-pound projectiles. Entire bunkers collapsed, observation posts disintegrated, and anti-tank obstacles were shattered. The shockwave rippled through the terrain, toppling trees and flattening foxholes, leaving defenders exposed. Soldiers in the line of fire reported being thrown off their feet, their ears ringing, their hearts racing at the invisible force raining death from miles away. The Long Tom's fire was precise, its effect overwhelming. Targets that would have taken hours of infantry assault were neutralized in minutes. As the day progressed, the guns shifted focus to interdiction missions. Supply depots, ammunition dumps, and rail lines feeding the Siegfried Line were systematically destroyed.
Convoys attempting to reinforce the front were annihilated before reaching the defensive belt. Intelligence reports recorded hundreds of enemy vehicles rendered useless, entire regiments delayed or forced to retreat under constant shell fire. German communications faltered as telephone poles were splintered and radio antennas shredded. The psychological toll was catastrophic. Commanders and troops alike described a pervasive sense of helplessness, an understanding that resistance against the invisible artillery force was futile. By mid-September 1944, forward observers coordinated fire to support combined arms operations. Infantry and armored divisions, previously slowed by minefields and barbed wire, now advanced under the protective umbrella of the Long Tom. Engineers followed the paths of destruction, clearing remaining obstacles, while tanks rolled into positions previously thought inaccessible. German defenders, facing unrelenting shell fire, were forced to abandon bunkers or risk annihilation. Casualties mounted, morale crumbled, and resistance faltered. In after-action reports, Allied commanders highlighted the Long Tom's critical role in the campaign. The guns not only destroyed fortifications, but reshaped the battlefield, dictating the tempo of operations and forcing German forces into reactive, defensive postures. The ability to deliver concentrated, long-range fire allowed for rapid penetration of the Siegfried Line, setting the stage for the Allied advance into the heart of Germany. By October 1944, the strategic implications were clear. The Long Tom had demonstrated the power of industrial-scale artillery, combining precision, range, and psychological impact to break what was previously considered an impenetrable line. Where German engineers had invested years in constructing barriers designed to stop tanks, artillery, and infantry, the 155mm shells had undone them in weeks. Allied momentum surged, and the Wehrmacht's ability to mount organized resistance collapsed under the weight of relentless fire. As the Allies crossed into Germany, the Long Tom remained a symbol of strategic ingenuity. It exemplified how planning, training, and industrial capacity could transform raw firepower into operational dominance. German soldiers, once confident behind their defenses, now recounted with fear and awe the devastation wrought by these seemingly distant weapons. For the Allies, the 155mm Long Tom was not merely artillery. It was a force multiplier, a harbinger of victory, and a testament to the decisive role of firepower in modern warfare.